Hello everyone, this is FIDE Master Viktor Neustroyev and thank you for joining our event today. Sorry we were about 8 minutes late, but well, now I think everything will work perfectly well because I recently tested my internet connection. It was completely fine. Also for today I prepared a reserve line if anything goes wrong with our streams on YouTube, Twitch. Instead, I will send you a Zoom link and we will continue our event in the Zoom format. Okay, so before we start, you see I changed the location, so could you please let me know whether it's better and if the sound, video quality and the internet is good enough. And I'm checking that other platforms work too. So looks like Twitch works. Actually, I don't need headphones. I completely forgot about it. So I'm using my main microphone, so this should be enough. But okay, so Twitch works. I can actually, okay, this works too. Yeah, so today it's a sunny day, so that's why I opened a window. So that's why the lighting is really good. I think so. So today we are going to talk about Caro-Kann Defense. Well, unfortunately, I don't have enough time um, to illustrate how to play Caro-Kann fully, so that you can start start playing this opening right away. But at least I can provide you with some ideas of what you should be doing when you play Caro-Kann, and especially how you should react if your opponent chooses the most complicated variation, the advanced variation, which I play myself and which is considered to be the strongest continuation. The strongest continuation against Caro-Kann. Okay, so here everything works. Here everything works too. Let me check this. Okay, all looks good. Yeah, so John, so I don't think I need to send you the link. We've already started, and thank you for being with us. I also send you the link because last time when we did a Christmas party, as a prize you got a free lesson, so you messaged me regarding it, and I told you that we need to negotiate regarding your and mine time zone. So for you to know, I'm in Argentina, so I'm plus 2 hours to Eastern Standard Time Zone, so plus 2 hours to New York, let's say. So message me with your time zone and your availability. Okay, fine, guys. Well, so let's start. What do you think? Let's start. So for today, I prepared 3 games as usual. And in these 3 games, I will try to illustrate most common ideas that Black has. So I'm not going to cover all deviations that all variations and all deviations that White has against Caro-Kann, but some of them definitely, yeah. So this is the most common position which Caro-Kann defense player should definitely learn. And well, you know, there are such moves like knight c3 to protect the pawn, knight d2, which is basically similar, and e takes d5. So, well, my students play either e5 or e takes d5. Well, e takes d5 is simple for those who don't want to learn a lot. For those who can just, well, for maybe 1000, so 1200, 1600 players. And the idea is to restrict this light squared bishop, bishop d3, And after knight f6, it's h3, stopping the bishop coming to f5 and g4. However, then after knight c6 and c3, let's say, e5 is considered to be strong enough, and white has to play approximately equal position. The main benefit here is that this pawn is still isolated and white actually doesn't risk to lose the game. So that's why my student played. However, the key idea is to restrict the bishop, as I said. And well, people who are not good at Caro-Kann and who doesn't know this opening well very often continues here with such move like e6, leaving the bishop here, which provides white with a clear play with knight e5 idea. So for example, bishop e7, castle, rook e1, b6, knight e5, bishop b7, knight d2, and then f4, knight f3, g4, and the strong kingside attack. So if you want to play Caro-Kann defense, you should definitely learn this line too. As for knight c3 and knight d2 move, of course, this is the best response, after which you can play either bishop f5 right away or knight d7, knight f6. Once I remember Magnus Carlsen was playing this opening with black pieces, he played this, his opponent reacted with this, creating a small trap of knight d6, and actually, Magnus Carlsen played this and blundered this very nice checkmate in 6 moves. Well, I actually think that the reason why it happened because he made a pre-move of this. Knight gf6 was a pre-move. Because a very common move here is knight f3, after which knight gf6 is quite good. So Magnus didn't expect his opponent to play queen e2. Okay, anyway, we are going to talk about advanced variation, after which black has two options. They can play c5 right away, and they can play bishop e5. Well, I actually don't play Caro-Kann with black pieces in tournament games, because I am quite good and Kann Sicilian, at Paulson Sicilian, and French defense too. So that's why I just don't need Caro-Kann, but I may consider playing this opening. So, but I play this a lot with white pieces, and I know a lot of what white should do here, what problems white can create for black. That's why and nowadays more people play Caro-Kann. That's why this opening becomes so popular. When I was younger, Caro-Kann was considered to be kind of well, not unsound, but I would say semi-sound opening. So, well, two moves. Bishop e5 is considered to be quite strong. c5 is also played quite often, but for the c5 moves, it looks like French, but it seems that black lost the tempo by playing c6 first and then c6, c5. Well, if white continues with c3, then knight c6, bishop f5, e6, black is completely fine, and this is what black wants to achieve when they play c5. They want to achieve French defense with the bishop being already outside of the pawn chain, so which eliminates the main drawback which black has to face when they play French defense. So that's why this strategy with holding the center doesn't work for white. Instead, they'd better take and ruin their center, but develop the initiative. So after e6, with the idea of taking there, I, as white, continue with a3, which is probably the most common idea, and after bishop c5, it's b4. So bishop c5, it's either b4 right away or knight f3 first and then b4. Let's say b4 right away. Bishop b6, bishop b2. The pawn is well protected. Well, f6 only weakens the black's position, but sometimes is playable too. So this is where white, in my opinion and according to my experience, is slightly better. So I wouldn't recommend playing c5. If to play, then bishop f5 is definitely a more competitive continuation. So what do you know about this position? What moves white has here? So who knows? What are the most common continuations here for white? Okay, so I'm looking for your suggestions here. So ah4 with knight c3 and bishop d3 is coming. Yes, and this is the exact line that we are not going to cover today. Well, e6, no, e6 is not played in this position. E6, bishop e6. So e6 is a clever idea, but not here. What else? G4. Yes, G4 is a possibility. So the most logical response is this. Knight f3, of course. Why don't you suggest it? Trading off the light squared bishops, I think here more favors black, because black actually wants to get rid of the bishops and locate their pawns on light squares. So, well, what black wants to achieve in this position? So let's say knight f3 and e6. They want to develop the bishop, the knight, and this knight too. Okay, I'm too far from the microphone, so let me bring it closer to me. So they need to develop these pieces, but you see, with the white pawn being already on e5, black experiences with a lack of space, right? So that's why exchanging their pieces would be a mistake. For example, bishop d3, knight e7. And then this knight goes to f5. So, well, instead you should keep the position crowded with more pieces. This is how black would struggle with developing their pieces. So they will have to play something like that, then bring the bishop back, then move the knight to g6, to f5, and so on. Well, h4 is a very common move. Well, here in Argentina it is. When I was playing in Russia, it wasn't so popular. So the idea of h4 is to grab more space and do g4 next. So this is the only line that we are not going to cover, because this is what I play myself with white nowadays, and I'm not ready to share my secrets right away. Maybe after I play 1 or 2 tournaments in the end, play Caro-Kann, I will publish a webinar devoted to this topic too. Well, so knight c3 is a possibility, but this move is not considered to be strong enough. There is no protection of the d4 pawn, so g4 is a move. G4 is actually nice. Bishop goes here, and then e6 can be played. In this game, we first start with knight d2. Then we will cover the other options too. So knight d2, e6, and the key idea of this move is to prevent c5. That's the reason of early knight d2. Now this knight comes to b3 to stop c5 coming. However, knight d7, bishop e3. So white focuses on the key idea of stopping this move. And here, for example, black can play quite naturally with this, bishop e2, bishop g6, with knight f5. So f4, knight f5 anyway, then bishop comes there, h5. Knight f3, bishop e7, castle, rook c8, c3. So white tries to hold the position, but black already activated their pieces, so they have some counterplay here. Well, they of course should prevent g4 move. They may obtain some counterplay with b6, c5. So this is the position that I would prefer playing with, maybe with black pieces. In that game, this is actually the game between two strong Chinese grandmasters, Le Quan Lem and Jeffrey Xiaoyong. So queen c7 was played instead. The idea of queen c7 is to play c5 and weaken the e5. However, not everything is so easy. Knight f3. And if, for example, c5 is played, how would you react with white? Who knows? Okay, so waiting for your suggestions, guys. By the way, I think the internet works really well today. Okay, so there is a good suggestion of playing bishop b5 here. Well, yes, bishop b5 is a possibility. What else do you have in mind? Bishop b5. Okay, I'm checking. Oh, okay, so three participants suggested bishop b5. Anything else? c3. Okay, George, thank you for C3 suggestion, but I don't think it makes much sense. I think in both cases, here black can continue with C4. The knight goes back, and now black has a very common plan of a pawn march. So with C4, they grab more space, and then they can initiate a pawn march to take advantage of extra space. So C4 instead. So c5. c4 instead is quite clever, but doesn't it blunder anything? So c4, let's say I can capture there, and if bishop takes, I can do this. And to be honest, I don't think this is a good idea. So because you have to take with the queen, after which I have this and this. So what to choose? Let's say I choose this move. And if, well, e5 is hanging too, so you have to play this move, but then after bishop e3, it seems that you have to take with the pawn. And after knight e7, knight g6, it seems that white loses the game. No, at least the pawn, after which, and they don't have any compensation. And e4 is always a problem because of that. So maybe rook c1 first, but then this move. And well, doing something like bishop discovered attack is a better idea because black can sacrifice the queen for the rook and then capture on f4. So it's definitely not an option. So bishop b5 is a possibility. Let's discuss this move. But then still c4 and the bishop is trapped. I mean, they have to exchange it for the knight, which is not a good idea. So knight bd2, then a6, and they have to exchange it. Instead, d takes c5 is a good move. Knight takes c5, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, and then bishop b5. Why bishop b5 only after that? It's mainly because the king cannot be, the check to the king cannot be blocked, and that's why the king has to move and lose his castling privilege, which white later in the game can take advantage of. So c5 is too early because of these bishop b5 ideas, which are quite common once c5 is played. What else you can suggest for black if it's not c5? Do we need just to develop the pieces naturally like that, or what? Okay, so looks like you don't have many suggestions. Instead, f6. And with queen c7, there is extra pressure on e5. So if they take, then it's this. And then you play bishop d6, castle, and play e5 later, having a very nice pawn structure. This is what I sometimes get, but in French defense, if I play French defense. However, I have such positions with the bishop being on c8. With the bishop on e5, it's much better. So bishop d3, this is what was played in the game. It's quite logical, because if now this, then how does the game continue? Now bishop f5, e takes f5, d takes e5, knight takes, then queen takes, and in this position just castle, threatening with rook e1. Even if you play bishop here, it's queen h5 first, g6, and queen h3. So black is not developed, and this is where extra pawn doesn't count because of too many threats. Okay, so is the e6 weak? Well, with the bishop on e5, it's not. But once this bishop is exchanged, probably yes. Black continued here with bishop g4. Now there is a pin and e5 is hanging, so e takes f6, knight takes f6, h3. What do you think? Which option to choose? Should we exchange or should we go back to h5 and probably face with g4? So, Brian, I need some explanation regarding rook c8 because our task is to develop pieces and castle, and doing rook c8 in a close position doesn't make any sense. Exchange and break with e5. Well, yes, exchange and break with e5 is a good idea, but there is something that you need to have in mind when you decide to play e5, and this is what we are going to talk about. So let's say bishop h5 in this position first, then g4, and the bishop has to go to f7, which doesn't look like a pleasant position for the bishop, right? And if they, let's say, somehow advance the pawn to f4, I would say that white obtains enough advantage here. So bishop takes f3. But what's wrong with e5 right away? So who can tell me? Thank you, John. If e5 is played right away, queen g3 is a possibility, and now this pawn becomes pinned. And how to develop the bishop? So bishop d6, queen g7, rook g8, queen goes to h6. And if you take on, well, if you play e4, then bishop goes back and defends the pawn. So there is no full compensation for the pawn. If instead rook takes g2, then after bishop f5, you cannot castle. And black is about to castle and try to play rook g1 and bring their pieces to the attack. Because if you just castle, you blunder on f6. Because this this knight is pinned. Well, can you please tell me if the quality of the stream became worse or not? If it's still okay. It's good. Thank you. So queen f6, and this is a completely winning position for white. So you see, first bishop d6, not e5 right away, because now queen g3 is not a possibility, and you are about to castle on the next move. There will be pressure on the queen, on the f2 square, and they gonna face with serious problems. So white continued with c4, which seems to be a very logical idea in order to stop e5. Because if e5 right now, it's c takes d5, and then even if pawn takes d5, there will be an isolated pawn on d5. So you see, for example, if let's say castle, e5, this, queen e2, and then I don't think we should take right away, maybe just castle first. Then this pawn central looks good, and once c4 is played, we always have an opportunity to take and keep the pawn structure optimal without any pawns being isolated. Well, but if let's say c4 and we play e5 in this position, they take, we take, then this happens. Then this pawn is a bit isolated. It's still not a tragedy for black, but I would better prefer having this pawn on c6, because if in case we pass the game into the endgame, the pawn may become weak. Well, this pawn is isolated, but it's not the classical IQP, so isolated queen pawn. No, it's not, because there is no white pawn on the e file or on the c file. That's why this pawn is also a passed pawn, and whether the pawn is a weakness or not depends on the ability of the pawn to move forward. While we see that these pieces stop d4, I don't think that we can move further with this pawn. That's why actually you would better have it on c6. Okay, so c4 is quite clever. How to react? So should we castle and wait until they take? Well, probably, but let's say we castle, and then if they take, we are fine. What if they play this move? The bishop is hanging. There is no counterplay with our knight, let's say knight a4, because they take here and attack our queen. So we have to move the bishop to a very unpleasant position, and then we will play e5, but c5 is not a weakness, and with c5 they moved our pieces back to the defensive positions. So yes, quite clever. Do not allow c5, and d takes c4 was suggested, but I don't really see the point. You make this a weakness, you can of course cover it with this, with knight d5, but then e6 is still a problem and you cannot castle, so you have to castle to the long side. Yes, the position becomes too cramped after c5. That's why bishop b4 check. So John already suggested this option. Bishop b4 check, king went to f1, which is definitely a mistake, because now two pieces are on the f file, the queen and the king, and black took advantage of it. Well, you may ask me, what's the point of playing king f1? And I definitely agree with you. No, this is definitely not a good idea. Instead, this or that would be a possibilities. So let's say bishop d2, take, queen b6, double attack. And if knight b3, then it's still this, threatening to take on c4 with a fork. So knight d2, queen b2, and there is no full compensation. So bishop d2 doesn't work, but knight d2 may work. In this case, this move doesn't make much sense. They can just ignore it or castle queen side, let's say. But we can still play e5. What now? Because we create a pin, there will be some activity. So if they continue with this move, queen g3, then d takes c4 first, bishop takes, and knight e4. This is the key idea, to add more pressure here. So maybe queen g7, but look at how white are not coordinated enough. For example, if they castle, what is the simplest way to obtain some material advantage here? Yeah, so exactly. Bishop takes f2, bishop takes d2, or bishop takes d2, bishop takes d2, and knight f2, which is a fork. Okay, fine. So if let's say here they do not play queen g3, but let's say they continue, well, e4 is a serious threat. Yeah, okay. So okay. So if e5, they may not play queen g3, right? So they may consider c takes d5 first to make our pawn isolated. And in such a case, what do we have to play? I think we can either castle right away or we can take on d4. So bishop d4 and then castle in this position. Also, instead of castling, we can force the king to move here. And after king d2, well, we either take on d5 or castle first and then take on d5. Because the king in the center becomes the object of the attack. So actually, knight d2 was the best option for them. And after e5, they could, for example, take on d5, then we take here, they take there, and this is where white could have some practical chances. It would be risky for white, but the engine thinks it would be approximately equal. Instead, after this move, king f1 was played. This move is a strategic mistake. Right now, black doesn't have an opportunity to convert this strategic mistake into something else. But instead, after castle queenside, black can pressure both. So knight e4 is coming. This is quite risky. So guys, if the quality becomes worse, just let me know, please. Okay, so let's continue. So now knight e4 is a threat, because let's say I just play a random move, knight e4, what happens? The queen goes there, it's knight g3 fork. If the queen doesn't go there, it's still dangerous. It's still knight g3, so queen g4, it's still knight g3, because there is a queen protecting this square. That's why white, after castling, needs already to spend a few tempi to secure their position. Queen e2. What would you suggest in this position? Does black have a tactical strike to initiate right away? Or does black need to bring more pieces and prepare for something? So for those who join us later, Today we are talking about Caro-Kann Defense. We are analyzing 3 games, and this is the first one where we discuss the most common ideas that Black has in Caro-Kann Defense. So the question is, what white should do in this position? Rook a to e8 is suggested by John, but the bishop can be trapped. Well, I don't think you should be worried about this. So rook a e8, and if they play c5, you play e5. And if they try to trap the bishop, you take their bishop. So rook a e8 is definitely the best move. Probably pawn to a3 is the best move, but then you play bishop d6, they play this, and you can still play e5. So you see, the queen and the king are both the object of the attack. g3, e5, d takes e5, knight takes e5, the position becomes completely winning because of the black pieces activity. So 2 rooks versus the king and the queen, some ideas of doing this or taking on c4. The game continued with king g2. What do you think black needs in this position in order to get a decisive advantage? So knight d3, queen takes d3, and then knight e4, which threatens on g3. Well, it does, but let's say you make these moves on the board, and then how are you threatening? Because once you sacrifice the rook, there will be a bishop protecting on g3 and the queen too. So I also think that with knight d3, you exchange your active piece to the enemy bishop, which right now cannot be converted into some advantage. Instead of doing this, you can play c5 with the idea of doing d4. And, well, the question is how to deal if they take. Definitely c4, which is a fork. And this move doesn't make sense because of c takes d4. Or c takes d3, I mean. So they played bishop g5. Of course, you can take, and there is a strong attack. But if you play queen c6, it's almost over. This is coming. So that's why they need to secure the e4 square, preparing for this. So, for example, d takes c4, bishop e4 doesn't work right now because we take with the knight. So that's why they liquidate our knight. However, if we take, I think they are fine. Well, they are relatively fine. But instead of taking this bishop, do we have anything else? Who can tell me? So d takes c4, d takes c4, then bishop e4, unfortunately. So this is the problem. Then queen f6. Okay, so d takes here, bishop here, queen f6, threatening here. Well, yes, you can definitely obtain some advantage here. Let's say they play this move. How do you win? Maybe you actually have this move. Well, but I'm sure that after bishop takes f6, instead of d takes c4 right away, you can find a better option. Who can tell me? I'm looking at your suggestions. Okay, so what do we have here? Knight takes g. How is it possible to take on g3 with the knight? D3. Yeah, knight takes d3, and if they take, it's d takes c4, attacking the queen. So this, and it's over. Because, well, they can block with the queen, actually, right? But you take, then you take here, then you take there, and it's game over. So knight d3. Yeah, so this is a pin. This is a discovered attack. How to survive here? Bishop d4, let's say. Then you just take on d4, and after they take your knight, you gain the queen, because this time the queen cannot block. So this is how the game ended. Let's go back and try to sum it up. So in this game, we analyzed knight d2 move with the idea of covering the c5 square. However, if you cannot play c5, you instead should focus on f6 and trying to weaken the e5 pawn to get your pieces developed. So black got what they actually wanted to get. The knight developed and the ability to play e5. So what you may remember from this game, if your opponent tries to prevent you from playing this move, c6, c5, then you should focus on e5 with your pieces. Or instead, you can, of course, try to do b6, c5. But every time when you decide to play c5, you should think about this diagonal. Okay, now we continue with the second game. The game played between Alexei Shirov and Vishy Anand. By the way, guys, well, could you please let me know which time zone you are in? So let's say we decide our participants into 3 groups. Let's say US, Canada, this is one group. Europe is the second group. And the third is like Middle Asia, for example. Middle West or Middle Asia together. So which group you are in? Because it's important for me, because I want to find the best timing for the webinar. So because I'm in Argentina, so if I conduct an event during my morning hours, then Europeans can join it. However, if I conduct it during working days, then Americans are probably at their work and won't be able to join. Okay, so let's continue. So if anybody else wants to share which time zone he is in, just message me in the chat. Let's continue. The game between Alexei Shirov and Vishy Anand. This time it was played g4. So where the bishop goes to? This is a big question, and actually this opening works really well at maybe 1500 level, because the bishop has to go to d7, which means that it occupies the square for the knight, and this is a bit unpleasant. If the bishop goes somewhere else, let's say to e4, then it's f3, bishop g6, and the key idea is e6. Why e6? F takes e6, for example. Then after h4, it's hard to develop pieces. So something like this is coming, and white is strategically winning. That's why after e6, it's queen d6. But after e takes f7, this bishop doesn't look so good. Same thing happens in case of bishop g6. h4 still is a possibility. e6 is a possibility too. But the best move here is knight e2, knight e4, taking advantage of the bishop's position on g6. So that's why after g4, the best option is to do this. However, even this move has its own drawbacks, such as the knight doesn't go to d7. The knight may go to c6 after c5, but it seems that black spent too many tempi if they want to play c5. In this position, white has several options. They can continue with knight c3, they can continue with bishop e3, and of course they can play c4, which seems to be the most logical reaction, because white spent a few tempi for nothing. That's why white should try to open the position in order to obtain to convert their opening to convert their advantage in development. Okay, so let's talk about other options. So knight c3 is quite common. Then e6. If we want to play c5, we need this pawn to be defended. Bishop e3. c5 right away is a possibility, but after d takes c5, if you want to capture the pawn on e5 or on c5, they play this with the idea of knight d6. So you may take, but then bishop takes, and if knight c6, you do not win these pawns. If knight d7, then what? Then f4 is enough, I think, and you may take on c5, but when they take on d7, you have to take with the king. Also, I think after knight d7, they'd better play b4. I'll let you take here, but then your king has to travel anyway. So this is a kind of a problem. So bishop e3 first, and then it's a bit hard for black to develop. They probably need knight e7, knight f3, h5, and then knight goes to f5. With c5, this time, when the d6 square is covered enough, it looks okay. Okay, so is bishop takes e6 silly? In which position? So e6 is played when the bishop is either here or here. After g4 you go, well, bishop e6 in this position is silly, right? Because after f4 you are in a trouble, because f5 is coming. And even if they don't play f5, they can just keep developing their pieces, and because of better center control, white obtains advantage. Okay, so here, the third move, yes, it's silly, because the bishop is not doing anything. And how do you develop your pieces then? After g4, bishop e6, yes, because of f4, it's silly too. So g4, bishop d7, and, well, bishop e3 is a possibility, then this, knight c3, knight e7, so it's basically the same thing as knight c3. In the game, it was played c4, e6, knight c3, and now black plays c5. It seems that black loses the pawn, but it's actually not true, because let's talk about c takes d5, e takes d5, and if knight takes, it's just bishop c6, taking advantage of the pin. If, let's say, d takes c5, like it was played in the game, where this pawn becomes weaker because after knight d5, bishop c6, bishop g2 is a possibility. However, I still don't think it's a good idea. Well, instead of bishop d7, bishop c8 is also a possibility, but then it doesn't make much sense to develop the bishop to f5 and go back to or to c8 if they already played g4, because g4 might be a helpful move for white. At least you should get the bishop to d7. So let's continue. We have here c4 was played, c4 e6, knight c3, c5. The game continued with this move. E takes d5, and there are several options. One is to play knight g2. The disadvantage of this move is bishop g4, rook g1 and h5. There may be no full compensation. Another common move is this. And then c takes d4, bishop takes d4. No, not bishop takes d4. If bishop takes d4, I think it's knight c6. So queen takes d4. And if you play this, it's queen takes d5. So knight e7, and then queen f4, let's say. Because if this move, then knight b to c6. Queen goes there, then take, bishop b4 check, bishop d2, and just queen c7, after which the position of white is completely ruined. So this, it's gonna be a fork on c2. They cannot castle queenside. The e5 is hanging. Rook d8 is coming together with some discovered attacks. So white is definitely worse. So they have to, in this variation, they have to take with the queen, and after knight e7, they have to continue with queen f4, after which they are relatively okay. This is, this is the best thing that they could do. But white played d takes c5. Now they threaten to take. So bishop c5, and if they decide to take in this position, what do you think we should do? Okay, so what do we have? Queen h4 in this position. Okay, I didn't consider this option at all, but looks like this is a double attack. This and these are hanging, so how to play? So queen h4 is quite interesting. Let's analyze this move. I don't think this is a good move, so I like knight h3 idea, but maybe queen c2 is a better move. Because this is a bishop attack too, so bishop b6, at least we can take on b6. Or maybe we can just play h3 to defend this pawn. Because if you decide to take, I take, and then I have queen c8. Okay, so it's not queen h4, but queen h4 was a nice idea. Well, queen h4, knight c7, king d8. Actually, knight e8, queen f2 mate. So the idea was good. After knight d5, I think you can just do this, bishop c6 still. And once they play this, let's increase the pressure on the piece which is pinned. And after knight e3, you can exchange the queens. So king takes, And then after knight g6, it seems that they lose the pawn on e5. And once the position becomes materially equal, black realizes that their position is much better from a positional point of view, because they can castle here with a check. Their pieces are definitely much more active. So knight d5 is not an option at the moment, but bishop g2 can be played first. Knight e7, and if knight takes d5, it's basically the same. If bishop takes d5, then just this move. And after queen takes, well, the knight cannot take because of this. So the queen can take. But then I think it's just queen b6, threatening here and threatening there. Should be good enough. Because even if queen d2, bishop c6, and f3 is no longer a possibility because of bishop takes knight for free. So knight e7, h3 was played. It's too early to take this pawn. So guys, if you play Caro-Kann, you can remember this trick, and you don't need to protect the pawn on d5. Instead, you may leave it hanging, hoping that they take, because even if they don't take, it's still okay. So queen b6, attacking here, queen e2, castle, d5 becomes vulnerable but cannot be taken right away. So for example, knight d5, bishop d5. And in this position, what do you have? You can at least do this and then continue with queen e5, taking the bishop back. This is one of the options. The other option is just bishop b5, and they are in trouble because of their queen's position. So, knight f3. How would you play in this position? It seems that white is going to solve all their problems once they castle, and maybe then they'll try to attack the pawn on d5 with more intensivity. f5, interesting suggestion. So f5 to open the position, but let's say f5 they take en passant. Then you what? Take with the rook or take with the queen? I don't like both ideas, to be honest. Let's say take with the rook, then I just castle. So not sure if you can benefit of this pin. Because if I play bishop e3, I should be fine. So I doubt that f5 is a good idea. Let's go back. What else do we have in mind? Pawn to d4. Yeah, pawn to d4 is a good idea, and so you should understand why this move is good. Let me try to explain what is happening in this game. So white is about to castle and get approximately equal position, because there will be no serious problems at the moment. So the most logical continuation for black is to continue with knight b to c6, right? Because this is the last piece that we need to develop in order to get all pieces coordinated. But if you do this, they castle, and then d4 doesn't look so effective. Instead, you'd better save a tempo on this move and force your opponent to find how to defend his position right away. And because of that, d4 seems to be quite challenging, because even if the knight goes to the center, which is typically good, your opponent still experience problems after bishop b5. So they cannot castle anymore. The queen moves, but they cannot castle. Yes, this bishop is under attack, and maybe we have to let them take it, because we don't know where to move it. And even if we find where to move it, d4 is hanging. So knight bc6, the last piece joins the place of action, but they cannot castle. So with queen d2, they cannot castle to the other side too, because the bishop is simply blocked. And now you see, because of inability white to castle, black obtains advantage in development. So our task is just to convert it. So here maybe taking on c5 was a good idea, but after queen f4, it's still knight g6 and they lose the pawn. In the game, a3 was played. Knight g6 anyway, b4. Now bishop goes back. d4 is not hanging because we played knight b to c6 in time. And bishop b2 was played. So try to guess which move was played with black in this position, after which Alexei Shirov had to resign. So black played a move and white simply resigned. How is it possible? Which move I'm talking about? Okay, so we have suggestions. Only one suggestion, okay. And actually, yes, so Hanif suggested rook a d8, which is generally speaking good, but rook f d8. Why? How do I define? Well, okay, guys, thank you for waiting me. Yeah, so there was a problem with internet. No. There was a problem with electricity. It turned off, and well, had to turn it on, and then my router was restarting for a few minutes. So thank you for waiting me. Let's continue. Is the sound good now? Can you still see the board? Okay, so thank you for waiting. Let's continue. So it's rook fd8. Why rook fd8? Well, yeah, just listen to me accurately, because this is what you definitely need to remember. When you play with one of your rook, you should decide where the other rook goes to. So let's say in this position, there are two files, semi-open, the D file and the E file. But it seems that the rook doesn't really do much on E8. However, the C file is completely open, and the rook is usually good at absolutely open files. So one rook goes to C8, the other rook goes to D8 seems to be the best option. So let's say rook, if this rook goes there, then where does this rook go? And this rook goes to C8, which is a nice spot. If you play with this rook, then you should decide where this rook goes. Looks like the only logical idea is rook fe8, but the E file is a bit more closed, with a lot of pieces being there, and with an ability to move the bishop somewhere only to f8, it doesn't seem like a good idea. You can capture the pawn on e5 with your pieces without any help of your rook, so the f rook goes to d8. So castle queen side. Well, actually, this is where the game ended. Alexei Shirov resigned, and the reason was just he didn't know what to play. The e5 pawn is lost, there is no compensation, positionally he is worse, and if we turn the engine on, it would say black is -4. Okay, I wanted to say -4, but now I turned the engine on and it's -0.5. Let me explain why. For example, let's say they castle queenside, knight g5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. If bishop d4, then after this check, the king has to go, and it's not b2 because of this fork, so it's b1, but then queen e6, and there are too many threats. We are threatening to play bishop d3, then take the bishop. The bishop is pinned. We are threatening to take the pawn on a3 too, and so they just don't have any ideas of how to defend it. Well, let's say they try to do this move, but even if they try this, we have this and knight takes with a fork, so it's a completely losing position. So what happened here? In this game, it was g4 played and bishop d7. After which black tried to play c5 in order to get the bishop released, so they sacrificed the pawn on d5. This pawn became a poisoned pawn, and white could still obtain a playable position if white continued with this. Bishop e3, c takes d4, queen d4, knight e7, and queen f4. This is quite playable. And maybe white, well, white has a playable position here, definitely. They have an isolated pawn, some problems with pieces development. The queen can be located here with some ideas of f4. So both players have chances to play for a win, but instead black decided to give up the center, which is quite common. They hoped to attack the pawn on d5, but it was impossible. If white takes this pawn, black gets enough initiative to compensate it. And the key moment was here when d4 was played and the position becomes strategically winning for black, because white after this is unable to solve their problems with development. They can't castle, and their pieces, especially the queen, becomes the objects of the attack. Okay, fine. So we have one more game to analyze today, but this game is really short. Oh, no, it's not. Sorry. So this time we are going to talk about knight f3 move as the most common option. So e6, bishop e2. This is how I play myself. Well, this nowadays I play h4 in this position, but before that I was playing this. c5. Well, okay, c5 is quite possible. Instead of c5, what else? They can play knight d7 and then something like c5. So c5, c4, and I think white is okay in this position. If instead black chooses this plan, well, then the position will be more closed. Well, it's quite playable, so if you want. In the game, black, it was Aveti Grigoryan, played c5. So c3, doing French defense system, isn't a good idea because the bishop is already on f5. Doing bishop e3 is probably the best option, but then white has to learn how to deal with queen b6. Well, when I played this position with white, I knew how to play. So after queen b6, I could continue with knight c3, and for example, after queen takes b2, it's queen b1, so threatening to take on b7. So for example, queen c3, then the queen is trapped. The only thing the queen can do, oh, actually, no, it's not trapped. They can go to a3, but they can take on c2, and after queen b7, the rook is trapped. If they just exchange and then play c4, I just play rook b7. And again, in this position, the material is equal, and this rook on b7 provides white with some initiative. Taking the pawn here is a possibility, but looks like white pieces are definitely much more active. King d2 and rook b1 quickly, but be careful with rook b1 because the rook may be hanging there. Okay, so, well, if bishop e3, then you have to learn how to play against queen b6. That's why white castled here. Knight c6. This is where, again, bishop e3 and c3 were two possibilities, but white wanted to play for a win and played c4. Well, c4 was definitely good when this knight is on d7, because the black pieces in this case look a bit ugly. So if okay, let me just show you. So if let's say here c5 and c4, look at this knight. On c6 it's definitely better placed. So for example, d takes c4, knight a3, as I said, this knight goes here. But if the knight is on c6, c4 doesn't look so good because the knight is adding more pressure here, as well as the queen is more open. So d takes c4, and this time knight a3, for example, is a mistake. Well, not in this position, actually. Well, actually in this position too, because you simply gain a pawn. Bishop e3, knight g7, and this is where knight a3 is a mistake. Who can tell me why? So, what are your suggestions, guys? Knight e d5, almost. c3 first. B takes c3 and then knight d5, because this bishop, this knight is under attack of the bishop. So if you want to save both the pawn and the knight, you have to play queen b3. But even after that, it's c takes d4, c takes d4, bishop takes, queen takes, and just queen e7. So, oh, well, white has a bishop pair, but look at these bishops. If we pass the game into the endgame, who is better? Definitely white, because of this knight, because of the pressure on d4. Okay, so bishop c4 was played. Bishop g4, adding more pressure on d4. And this is where white should realize that they need to give up the center and continue the game like that. So bishop b5, knight takes d3, pawn takes, bishop c5, but after bishop c6, it's not so bad. So for example, queen a4, you take on e3, but then both the bishop and this pawn are under attack. So this is where white would have a chance to equalize. In the game, they played the logical move knight bd2. But at the same time, this move is already a mistake. And after c takes d4, they are a pawn down. So bishop g5, h6. Oops, no, h6. So doing bishop h4 and then, well, bishop h4, then g5, then knight e4 would be the best option for white, threatening with these two dangerous checks. How would you continue if that would happen? So they're trying to checkmate on f6 as well as knight d6 is a good idea. Knight f5, yeah, knight f5 seems to be okay. Then knight f6 check, king e7, bishop g3. Well, I think they are okay, actually, because the king is in a very unpleasant situation. So instead of this move, I think you have something else. Yes, I think Hanif is absolutely correct. It's bishop g7. Why bishop g7? Because actually knight d6 is not a serious problem when we see that the pawn on e5 is hanging. So now bishop goes back, knight g6, and even if they take on b7, we are still fine. So knight d6, then they lose this pawn, the knight becomes hanging, and the bishop on c4 becomes hanging too. There is extra pressure on this pin, so black is winning. So that's, anyway, it was better for white to play bishop h4, but they played knight e4 right away, having in mind the idea of this. Then they take the rook and they are completely fine, because maybe their knight escapes. So, but there is something wrong with this. What exactly is wrong? Who can tell me? How black should continue here? No, I mean, in this variation, does rook remain there forever? No, once you take the pawn on e5, you can bring the king to g7. And it's not really important if you if you gain the material. So knight e4. Wait a sec. So in this position, I am asking you what you should do, and you say knight takes e4. Ah, you mean knight takes e5. Okay, got it. Knight takes e5. Okay, knight takes e5. I think there is something wrong with this move.
So for example, knight takes, bishop takes d1 and bishop b5. Looks like you have to play this move, but then bishop d8, and it seems that white is better. No, it's definitely not a good idea. Maybe taking on f3 first, and then playing knight e5 looks good. Because if bishop b5 in this position, you can just block with the knight. What do you think? With which knight to block? Who can tell me? So knight e6. Well, both knights are located on the e file, so you should mention which one, the 7th or the 5th. So knight 7 to c6. Okay. Yes, actually, knight 7 to c6, because the queen is hanging too. So the queen goes to h5. What else they can do? Because if they take here, their position is absolutely lost. So you take here, you have two extra pawns, there is nothing to talk about, especially when two grandmasters are playing against each other. So queen h5 was played. The queen moved to the safe place, and this bishop is not hanging anymore. But queen d5. Now these two pieces are hanging. However, f4. So if you take there, they take here. But I think it's actually okay. Moreover, in this position, black found even a better move. Can you guess what is the best move for black in this position? Knight g6. Yes, John, this move is really nice, because with knight g6 you also defend the rook, which makes the bishop hanging. There is a pin. This and these are hanging both, so they had to play this move. But after h takes g5, there is just no compensation for the piece. So this is where white should resign, actually. However, they continued the game hoping for an attack. Of course, if e takes, it's just knight f6 with a fork. Well, this is a discovery check and a double check too. So, but knight f4. They sacrifice the rook, so, I mean, they sacrifice the exchange, so now black is a rook up. F takes e6, f takes e6, and after bishop c4, black played a move, after which white resigned. What do you think? Which move you can play? There are a lot of options, but what do you think is the simplest in order to equalize? Queen h5. Well, yeah, queen h5 is interesting, but I think they played a better move. Okay, what other suggestions? Queen h5 also. Okay, guys, so queen h5 is definitely good. It threatens a mate and it threatens to exchange the queens, and I think it would work. In the game, it was this move played. Why? Well, the queen is under attack, so taking isn't a good idea. So, for example, after rook d8, it's really hard to defend. Let's say rook d8, threatening with rook d1, knight c3, bishop c5 check, king goes there. Well, then at least this is a good idea. Maybe you can just play this and this in order to promote, or knight d4 and then f3. Okay, fine. So d3, if bishop takes d3, it's castle queen side. And if, let's say, rook d1, you play bishop c5, for example, they take, queen takes, king goes there. How would you play in this position? Sacrifice the exchange? Well, yes, but what's the point of it, the exchange sacrifice? Of course you can, but... Pawn to e5, knight d4. Well, guys, you definitely have a better option. Once you find it, you will say, okay, yeah, this is definitely the best move, and black wins. Or you mean, Brian, you mean sacrifice the exchange? You mean rook d3 move? This? Well, then probably rook d3. Or maybe queen d3. No, it doesn't look like a good idea. At least I don't see the point of this sacrifice. Well, queen e3 to exchange the queens. Well, I would say yes, 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 and one more time, yes, if there was no better move after which black wins immediately. So what I can say, guys, I'm working on the course which is called Improve Your Tactical Vision. Of course, well, maybe later we'll change the title, but it's about tactical vision, which is quite important because you may be good at positional playing, you can be good at calculation, but if you don't see what you need to calculate, you may miss a lot. So yes, finally Hanif is able to find it. It's rook takes h2. So how to find these tactical strikes? This is what my course will be about. So they cannot move the king, so they have to take only, and then rook h8 leads to m8 because you cover all the squares he can escape. They can block on h7 or h5, but it's just a temporary defense, and that's it. This is how the game ended. So let's go back and try to sum it up. So this is the line where bishop f5 was played, and white continued with knight f3, playing the most competitive, one of the most competitive variations. Bishop e2 c5, and instead of playing the most competitive line of bishop e3, after which some knowledge is required from white, some knowledge is really a must for white in that case, they played castle, which is a possibility, but then they have to play accurately. For example, in this position, they have to play bishop e3. They played c4, trying to combine the ideas from two different lines. But this time with the knight on c6, c4 doesn't look good. It works really well when the knight is on d7. When the knight is already on c6, it's not so good. And then finally, white experienced problems with the pawn on e5 after this pin. They could give up the center and let us take the pawn, which wasn't a good idea at that moment. We could play knight f5, which seems to be better, and then white would be able to equalize. But they play knight d2, gave up the pawn on d4, and then also later gave up the pawn on e5. So this is what I wanted to share with you on the webinar today. Well, I'm sure it was good. Very sorry about the electricity that went down. Well, this time it's not about internet connection, it's about electricity. So one of my monitors also turned off. However, my laptop continued working, but I was unable to continue this stream on Facebook and my own YouTube account, as well as on Twitch, unfortunately. So what we gonna do, I think I gonna change the format of the webinars, and maybe we will try to do a Zoom meeting. And for those who won't be able to join Zoom, we will make a stream. I'll try to stream through Zoom. Maybe it will be better. Okay, guys. So thank you for joining. Just a few things I want to tell you about. There will be a masterclass by one of our coaches, FIDE Master Armin Mushevich. The webinar will be, the masterclass will be about Grunfeld, how to play Grunfeld defense with black pieces. I think it might be quite helpful for you. It is scheduled for the beginning of February. I'll send you emails. And before that, your favorite author, FIDE Master Pavel Martynov, will conduct the webinar devoted to how to attack. So the topic is 10 best attacking plans. As for our webinar next Sunday, there will be a webinar. I'm not sure what idea I'm going to cover, but I'll message you. If you have any suggestions, please send me an email to Tricks of Chess. Oh, did I? Okay, interesting. So email me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. So I'll message you here. tricksofchess@gmail.com. Okay, so this is my email. And actually, okay, so Hanif messages me and says that I defeated him with white pieces here in Caro-Kann. So let me show you. e4, c6, this. Yes, this is what I played, c4, 5. So the knight is not on c6, and I played c4. So knight e7, castle, c takes d4. So knight c6 is the best option here. C takes d4, knight d4. So once my knight goes to d4, it's completely different strategy because the bishop becomes under attack. So this I take here. Knight takes a5, c takes. And knight a5 was definitely a mistake because of my move bishop b5. And then you are in trouble. Rook e1, queen e7. Bishop g5 is a nice move actually. Queen f7 and queen d5. Okay, queen d5 looks really nice. So, of course, knight takes a5 is a mistake. Instead, you should play this move, but this is where I think you are almost... Yeah, I think it's equal, actually. The engine thinks white is slightly better here, but it's quite playable. Well, without this bishop, I mean, if black loses this bishop for the knight, then white seems to be better. So that's why once c4 is played, you have to continue with knight c6. So you see it's quite similar. But this is where I play c4 without castling. This is important. I do not lose a tempo on castling. Okay, fine. So anyway, if you have any questions, any suggestions, you can message me at tricksofchess@gmail.com. Okay, so yeah, this is a good topic. How to find blind spots and avoid blunders. Okay, very good topic, but I definitely need to think about it. Okay, thank you for coming. See you next Sunday, same time.